long enough for us to make sure this isn't some freak happening that will undo itself, and also to give us time to get used to the fact that you can walk." "Okay," Lynn said. "I'd just as soon stay another couple of days anyway. Can I go back to my room and have another breakfast? I didn't get a chance to finish my first one." As soon as he was alone in his room, he went to the window and peeked out. Below was the street, and to the left he could see the sidewalk that led to the main entrance of the hospital. Across the street were office buildings, and after a moment he found what he had half expected to find. Hugo Fairchild was standing on the sidewalk watching the entrance of the hospital. "You should stay in bed." Lynn whirled at the sound of the voice, then relaxed with a relieved sigh. It was the doctor. "Okay, Doc," he growled. He went and sat on the edge of the bed. A twisted smile curved the doctor's lips. "You know," he said, "you aren't the only miracle that happened in this hospital today." Lynn blinked. "Don't tell me Dorothy Lake, the girl in that other car, is the other one?" "How did you know?" the doctor said. "Yes, it was she. 5 fractured ribs and a broken right arm, and a severe laceration on the cheek, and not a sign of them now." "Where is she?" Lynn demanded. "I've got to see her." "I wish I knew what was going on," the doctor said. He studied Lynn silently. "I'll ask Miss Lake if she will see you." Lynn lay down and tried to relax while the doctor was gone, but his eyes didn't leave the door. It was over an hour before the nurse came in with a robe and the information that "Miss Lake wants to see you." He followed her the full length of the hallway. She opened the door for him. He went past her into the room and saw the face he had seen through the windshield. "I'll leave you alone for 10 minutes, the nurse said. "Hello," Dorothy Lake said nervously. Lynn saw that she was afraid. "Hello," he said. "You don't need to be afraid of me. I won't eat you. As a matter of fact, I'm awfully sorry I ran into you. If there's anything I can do, I'll pay the hospital bill, of course." "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "It's the way I woke up this morning with nothing wrong with me. It scares me. I don't know what to make of it." Lynn started to say something and thought better of it. "And there's something else," Dorothy went on. "It's the man that insisted on seeing me yesterday. He demanded that I give him a paper I was supposed to have. He wouldn't believe me when I told him I didn't know anything about it." "Was his name Hugo Fairchild?" Lynn asked. "Yes." "I see it all now," Lynn said grimly. "Your fate was written on that slip of paper, too." "My fate?" Dorothy said, bewildered. "And he made us get well so we would have to leave the hospital," Lynn went on. "When we leave, he'll get us and take it away from me." Dorothy laughed nervously. "Don't leave it there. I think I'm really insane. The things that are happening can't happen. That's a good test of insanity, isn't it?" "Don't be silly," Lynn said. "When a thing happens, it can happen, no matter how impossible it may seem. Let me tell you what happened to cause all this." "Please do," she said. "I'm sure it can't be any more impossible than my bones healing up and a bad cut on my cheek vanishing overnight without even leaving a scar." "You think not?" Lynn said grimly. "Then listen to this. You remember when we were about to hit, a fraction of a second before the crash? At that precise instant when you were staring at me reproachfully, I suddenly found myself in... I don't know where it was, but I know it wasn't on this earth. I followed a path up to a high table rock overlooking an immense valley, and there on that high perch was a statue." "A statue?" Dorothy echoed. "Don't interrupt," Lynn said. "You can't possibly understand. I don't myself. So just listen to what happened and what I think it means. It was a moving statue, like a robot in a way. But it was more than that. I'm sure of that now. It was, in some way, a god, the god of fate. It was typing on a typewriter of some sort that had an automatic feed to supply a new sheet of paper every time the old one was yanked out. And beside the typewriter was a wastebasket sort of thing with a flame burning at the bottom. The statue would fill a sheet of paper with typing, and then yank it out and drop it in the basket, and it would instantly burn. And I know now that the very process of burning that sheet of paper made reality out of whatever was written on it. And to cut a long story short, I yanked a sheet of paper out of the statue's fingers just as it was about to be dropped into the flame." "But," Dorothy said weakly. "That piece of paper," Lynn said firmly, "was our fate. Yours and mine. On it was written that we were to die in that accident. And until that paper is returned to that place and burned in the flame, we cannot die." She was looking at him queerly now. You think I'm crazy? Lynn said. Hugo Fairchild came to get that paper, didn't he? And I have it. Fairchild's waiting outside the hospital for me. Or you, to come out with it, too. I saw him from my room. How, Dorothy said weakly, how did you get over into that other world? I don't know, Lynn said. I just did, that's all. Then Hugo Fairchild is from this other world? It's obvious, isn't it? Lynn said. But it's too late for him to do any good now, isn't it? She persisted. The accident is over. We weren't killed. Lynn shook his head slowly. It isn't too late, or he wouldn't want it. Don't you see? We, you and I, can't die until he gets it. That's why he wants it, since it's written on it that we died in that crash. The moment it burns, we'll be back where we were when I snatched that paper from the flames, and we'll die in that accident. Then all of this, our being in the hospital and all, will never have happened. It was the next day Dorothy had come to Lynn's room. She was peeking out the window at Fairchild down on the sidewalk. What will we do, Lynn? She asked, turning to him. We can't hope to fight him. He must have supernatural powers, or he couldn't have caused us to recover so miraculously. I don't know, Lynn said. We'll have to sneak out the back way or something. We have to leave tomorrow, you know, or... Look, he's after the paper, and you don't have it. It's me he wants. I'll leave first with that paper. Then you'll be free and can forget about it. I still can't believe it, Dorothy said. If it weren't for the fact that my ribs were definitely broken and I saw that nasty cut on my cheek. You know there's no other explanation, Lynn said. But how could writing on a piece of paper form reality? She objected. It just can't. But it does, Lynn said. What is reality? Scientists have been trying to find out since time began. There could be different kinds of reality. Ours could be subject to the minds of beings on another plane of it. This robot could sit there and write out things that happen and make them happen here. It has to be that. I know, Dorothy said. It has to be that, even if it doesn't seem possible. She left the window and went to a chair and sat down. Lynn, she said, if he gets that paper, we both die. I'm going with you. I couldn't stand going out alone and not knowing when he gets it. Nonsense, Lynn said. He won't get it. You can forget about it. What if he never gets it? Dorothy asked. Then we'd live forever, Lynn grinned. Maybe that's why he has to get it back. Suppose, Dorothy said, suppose, don't think I'm silly, but suppose we destroyed it on this plane. Then it could never go into that flame. I don't know. Lynn frowned. Maybe any flame would make it happen. It would be an awful risk to take. We wouldn't have to burn it, she said. We could tear it into little bits and let the wind carry them away one at a time. I'll have the nurse get it, Lynn said. When the nurse brought it, Dorothy examined it eagerly, trying to read what was typed on it. A light of excitement danced in her bright blue eyes. Finally, she held it in a position to tear it. Shall I? She said. Lynn nodded. She hesitated a moment dramatically, then abruptly pulled her hands in a shearing movement that should have torn it easily. It didn't. Here, let me do it, Lynn said. He took it and tried to tear it, without success. He grunted and exerted every ounce of strength. It remained intact. That's funny, he said. It tore easily when I grabbed it from fate. Let's burn a little corner of it and see what happens, Dorothy suggested. Lynn went to the bedside stand and got his lighter. He held the flame to one corner of the sheet of paper. A minute went by. 2 minutes. The paper refused to burn or even char. Huh, Lynn said, snapping his lighter shut. Well, it's a cinch that scissors will cut it. I'll ask the nurse to bring us a pair. 10 minutes later, he was trying to cut it without success. It would bend between the blades of the scissors or stop them from coming together at all. But it wouldn't cut. It's indestructible on this plane of existence, Dorothy said. Now I believe you, Lynn. I'm glad you do, Lynn said dryly. So now it's clear what I should do. My job is to hide this someplace where Hugo Fairchild can never find it. You can go your way and forget about it. Dorothy shook her head. No, she said. I'm going with you. We'll face this together. couldn't stand the suspense of wondering when Fairchild would catch up with you and get it." "You get used to it," Lynn said. "After all, everybody has to die sometime, and no one spends much time worrying about when it will come." "But this isn't the same," Dorothy said stubbornly. "That man is after it, and when he gets it, we'll die. I'm sticking with you. And that piece of paper." Lynn went to the window and peeked out. Fairchild was still in sight, watching the main entrance of the hospital. "Okay," he said, turning back to Dorothy. "Go to your room and put on your street clothes. We're going to leave now. We'll sneak out the back way." Lynn watched the door close, then went to work. Folding the piece of paper several times until it was a compact square, he taped it to his side under his left armpit where it couldn't be noticed. He dressed swiftly, wrote a hurried note informing the hospital he wasn't sneaking out to avoid paying his bill. He left the note on the bed in plain sight and started toward the door. Just as he reached it, he remembered Dorothy's hospital bill. He went back and added a PS for the hospital to put her on his bill. Opening the door, he peeked out. A nurse was in the hall. He watched her until she went into a room, then slipped out and hurried toward the stairs. He was grinning to himself. Dorothy wouldn't have had time yet to get dressed, and he had no intention of waiting for her. It would be too dangerous. She would find him gone. She would be unable to find him, and eventually she would take up her life where it had left off. In time, she would forget him and think the whole thing a dream. That was the best way. He passed people on the stairway without meeting anyone who would recognize him. In the basement, the risk was greater. There were dozens of people, but no one stopped him as he hurried toward the exit. They considered him just a visitor, he reflected. The critical moment was just ahead of him now. 100 questions were tormenting him. How had Fairchild known which hospital he was in? How had Fairchild known it was he who had stolen that paper? He shrugged the questions off. There was no way of knowing now. If Fairchild had powers that would enable him to discern that he was sneaking out the back way and be there waiting for him, he'd just have to make the best of it. At the exit, he paused and peeked out. There was a wide concrete driveway. An ambulance was parked there. No one was in sight. He opened the door boldly and stepped out. He started along the driveway with an appearance of casual unconcern, as though he were a visitor taking a shortcut. "Not so fast, Lynn." He turned quickly. Dorothy was half running to catch up with him. He felt his pulse leap and somehow couldn't feel anger. Dorothy smiled knowingly at him. "I figured you'd try to escape alone," she said, "so I hurried." "Well, it was an idea," Lynn said. "Come on, we've got to put distance between us and Fairchild before he discovers we're gone." They reached the driveway exit. It was on a side street from the main entrance. Fairchild wasn't in sight. "Where'll we go?" Dorothy asked nervously. "How about my apartment?" Lynn said. "We can stay there months at a time without going outside." She gasped, then saw that he was laughing at her with his eyes. "I'll have you know," she said angrily. "Know what?" Lynn prompted. "Let's go someplace," she said. "We can't just stand here." "There's a taxi," Lynn said, taking her hand and pulling her after him into the street. In the taxi, he gave the driver directions. "First National Bank down on Center Street," he said. "Wait there. We're going to the airport from the bank." And to Dorothy, in a lower voice, "We'll put some real distance between us and Fairchild. After that, you can go your way and I'll go mine." "If that's what you want," she said. She broke suddenly. "Oh, Lynn, I don't know what I want. I don't want to leave you. I'm afraid. Or maybe I'm not. I don't know. It's all a rotten mess. Why couldn't we have met normally so that if—" She bit her lip and turned away. The taxi hummed along for several blocks while they were silent. When Lynn spoke, his voice was low and serious. "Maybe I feel that way too," he said. "But you know what's wrong with it? We're running away. It's like being an escaped criminal with a death sentence hanging over you." "But it needn't be," she said, laying her hand on his arm. "The police aren't after us or anything like that. We've given this Fairchild the slip now. All we have to do is go away somewhere and he'll never find us." "He'll be looking," Lynn said. "And we'll wake up every morning with the knowledge that this may be the day he finds us." He turned and looked through the rear window of the taxi. "Actually, I'm surprised we gave him the slip. I can't understand it." "You feel that way?" Dorothy said with a shaky laugh. "I do too. He found us in the hospital. I keep thinking he just knows things. You know what I mean?" "He didn't know which one of us took that paper," Lynn said. He frowned. "But he knew it was one of us. He must know what's on it. He has supernatural powers, too. Look how he fixed us up." He looked through the back window again. When he straightened, he fixed his eyes on Dorothy's face. "Dorothy," he said, "maybe nothing can stop him from getting the paper back soon. It may be hours or days, but would you marry me and make the most of it until—" She began twisting her fingers together nervously. I don't know what to say," she hesitated. "It seems so wrong in a way. I don't mean wrong, unfair, that's it. Unfair to both of us, like we were doing this whether we love each other or not. It doesn't give whatever love we could have had a chance." Lynn stared at her a moment. "Then let's turn around and go back and give it to him," he said quietly. Let's... Suddenly she was in his arms, her face buried in his collar, her body trembling. She lifted her head until her cheek rested against his. Her voice was a whisper in his ear. "Let's get married." "Boy, have you two got it," Phil Arnott said. "You get me on the phone and tell me to rush to town, and you can't wait 5 minutes. What's the matter? Afraid you'll fall out of love if you don't plunge?" "We wouldn't have waited for you to get here," Lynn said. "Only we have to have a witness, they said when we got the license." He looked pleadingly at Dorothy. "Please, honey, let's skip the church. You don't have to be married in one, do you?" "It's got to be a church," she said. "That's the one thing I've always been certain of." "Why not?" Phil said. "There's a dozen churches that exist on weddings. Don't even have a congregation, just weddings. One of them ought to have a vacancy 10 minutes today." They found a phone booth, and Lynn began making calls. The third number was answered by a man with an Irish brogue who blessed them for their eagerness and agreed to perform the ceremony at once. "Ha!" Lynn said when he hung up. "We'd have got along without you okay, Phil. Reverend O'Hara said he has a witness on hand all the time for couples like us." "I'll trail along anyway," Phil grinned. "What is the rush, though? How long have you two known each other?" "We ran into each other a few days ago," Dorothy said, taking Lynn's hand and leading him toward the sidewalk. Phil followed them and noted silently the way they glanced anxiously about when they were out in the open, as though afraid of being seen by someone. Lynn flagged a cruising taxi again. The three of them piled into it, and Lynn gave the address of the church. Phil broke the silence after a few blocks. "I'm being nosy, I know, but you two were obviously looking to see if you were being followed. Why don't you tell old Uncle Phil about it, huh?" "About what?" Lynn said, turning innocent eyes on him. "Nothing," Phil said. "Only sometimes 3 heads are better than one. If you two or one of you is in trouble, maybe I could be of help if I knew what to look out for." "I doubt it," Lynn grunted. "In fact, if we told you, you wouldn't believe it, so skip it." "So it is trouble," Phil murmured. "I thought so." He grunted. "Count me in on it. What is it, bank robbery?" "Worse than that," Dorothy said. "But let's forget it. I want to relish every minute of my wedding." "Just like a woman," Phil said, lifting his eyes upward. "My wedding, she says." The taxi chose that moment to pull to the curb and stop. Outside was a small and picturesque church. "Go on in and get things started," Phil said. "I'll pay the driver." "Tell him to wait," Lynn said. "This shouldn't take more than 10 minutes." He took Dorothy by the hand and led her toward the entrance. Phil grinned at the taxi driver and shrugged. "As best man, I get to kiss the bride first," Phil said 15 minutes later. Lynn jumped, startled. He exclaimed. "I've never kissed her yet myself." He put his arms around her and kissed her lingeringly. She pulled away from his embrace finally, one hand trying to keep her hat on her head, murmuring, "It's about time." But the bright lights in her eyes said that it was worth waiting for. "Bless you, my children," the minister said, smiling. "Oh, yes, how much do I owe you?" Lynn said. Realizing his mistake, he hurriedly took out his billfold and handed the man a $20 bill. He turned to Dorothy, not waiting for the thanks he expected. Phil correctly interpreted the minister's dismayed look and slipped him another 10. "He doesn't realize the overhead ate that up," he whispered. "He doesn't get married very often." "Oh, I see," Reverend O'Hara whispered. Phil hurried after Lynn and Dorothy, catching up with them just outside the front entrance. "Now," he said grimly as they got into the taxi again, "you want to be alone. My price for leaving you alone is for us to go somewhere first and have a drink or two, which you would anyway, and listen while you tell me what's behind all this rush." He looked sidelong at Dorothy and chuckled. "Surely it wasn't a race with the stork, or is the hospital our next stop?" "Of course not," Dorothy said indignantly. "We just came from there this morning." "Then this was," Phil said half seriously. "Not what you think," Lynn said. There's the Shangri-La ahead. We can have a couple of drinks there and something to eat. And we'll tell you all about it, though you won't believe a word. It was almost 2 hours later, and 4 drinks later. So you see why, Lynn was saying, while Phil stared at them with round eyes. We don't know how long we have. Maybe. He looked anxiously toward the gloom of the entrance across the room. He could walk in during the next minute. I can't see why he doesn't. I know he knows where we are. I feel it. And you have this paper taped to your side under your shirt? Phil said. Let me see it. No, Dorothy said. I've known Phil most of my life, Lynn said. He's all right. Anyway, you know the thing's indestructible on this plane. Dorothy hesitated, then reluctantly nodded her agreement. Lynn yanked the folded paper from under his shirt. Phil took it, unfolded it curiously, and frowned at the strange typewritten characters on it. You say it's indestructible? He asked after a moment. We tried to tear it, to burn it, and to cut it with scissors, Lynn said. All it does is bend. Phil tried to tear it, cautiously at first, then exerting every ounce of strength in his fingers. He gave up and examined the paper with a new respect in his eyes. I almost think I believe your tall tale, he said musingly. He dipped his finger in his cocktail and rubbed it over the characters on the paper. Though they became wet, they didn't blur or fade. He took out his lighter and touched the corner of the paper to the flame. When it didn't char, he touched it again and let the flame play on one corner for a moment, then touched the corner with his fingers. Just warm, he grunted. He began folding the paper up the way it had been. Of course, there's one way I could help you, he said slowly. You could let me keep this. I could hide it where even you wouldn't know how to find it. That way, when this character catches up with you, it's out of your hands. That's an idea, Lynn said. But we wouldn't know you had it. Maybe he could worm it out of us, and then he'd be after you. And it wouldn't be your life that hung in the balance. True enough, Phil said. He cupped the folded paper in his hand, closing his fingers over it. There's 1 or 2 points I'm not clear on, Lynn. You said you grabbed it when it was still in Fate's fingers, and that's when that part tore off. You were able to tear it then. Why can't you now? I don't know, Lynn said. Things are just different over there, I guess. It burns over there, too, remember, in that flame. Yes, I know, Phil said. I just... A terrified gasp from Dorothy interrupted what he had been about to say. Her eyes were wide and round, and fixed on the entrance across the room. Fairchild, Lynn gasped. Phil turned his head and glanced briefly at the man who stood there surveying the occupants of the room. He got swiftly to his feet just as Fairchild saw them and started toward them. Well, goodbye, kids, he said casually, but his broad wink warned them to let him escape with the paper that was still hidden in the palm of his hand. Give me back, Lynn blurted, but Phil was hurrying toward the entrance, passing Hugo Fairchild. Lynn sighed in relief as Phil made it to the door and vanished. Well, well, Fairchild said. I finally tracked you two down. So you're married now. He slid into the seat Phil had occupied. Yes, we're married, Lynn said coldly, and we want to be alone. I don't doubt that, Fairchild said. I don't doubt it at all. I sympathize with you, but I have my job to do, you know. I'll bet you sympathize with us, Dorothy said worriedly. But I do, really, Fairchild said, and to prove it, I'm going to make you a nice offer. I don't have to, but I can, and I will. Give me the paper, and I'll promise not to toss it into the flame for a whole year. That will give you a year of happiness. It won't do any harm in the long run, because the instant that paper is consumed, everything goes right back to the instant of the crash, and world events go on as they should have in the first place. But I'll stick to my bargain, if you give me the paper without trouble. But we don't have it, Dorothy blurted. You don't? Fairchild exclaimed. His eyes widened in sudden comprehension. That fellow. He half rose and looked toward the exit. He glanced back at their faces and saw that he had guessed right. Waiting for no more, he leaped across the room, bumping into a waiter and causing him to spill a tray of drinks. Then he was out the door before anyone could stop him. I hope Phil has sense enough to get far away and quick, Lynn groaned. Come on, Dorothy, let's see. He dropped enough money on the table to take care of the check and, taking her arm, hurried after Fairchild. 20 feet away, a crowd had gathered about a central point. They ran to the crowd and pushed their way toward its center. Dorothy gasped, and Lynn tensed at what they saw. Phil was getting slowly to his feet, nursing a large bruise under one eye with gentle fingers. "The other guy just vanished," someone said, unbelieving. "I saw him. He just vanished in thin air where he was standing." "Did he get it?" Lynn said, helping Phil to his feet. Phil nodded, then muttered, "Let's get away from here. I think I need another drink." Lynn's legs were suddenly watery. Dorothy's lip was trembling. "A drink," Lynn said dully, then, determinedly, "Yes, a drink." He took Dorothy's arm in his fingers. "Come on, honey. Maybe we'll have time." "A drink?" Dorothy said shrilly. "We're going to be dead in another minute, and all you want is time enough to have a drink?" "That isn't it at all," Lynn said. "Let's get off the street." He guided her firmly through the crowd, Phil following in their wake. They went back into the Shangri-La once more and back to their table where their unfinished drink still rested. "I'm sorry you took what I said the wrong way," Lynn said. "Believe me." "It's all right, darling," Dorothy said. "I know you didn't mean it that way. It's just that, well, we haven't had a chance together." Her lips started to tremble again. Then she was smiling bravely. "That's the girl," Phil said. "You should talk," Lynn growled. "You aren't going to die." "Let's drink to that or something," Phil said. "I need one, and I'm sure you both do too." They drank solemnly. Lynn and Dorothy were looking into each other's eyes as they drank. "I wish—" Lynn choked. "I know," Dorothy said. She leaned across the table and Lynn kissed her. "Cigarette?" Phil asked, holding out his pack. They each took one, and he lit them with his lighter. "3 on a match," Dorothy said nervously. "I guess it's all right this time, though. The conclusion is foregone." "Wonder how long it will take," Lynn said, sucking in the smoke hungrily. "That's another thing," Phil said. "That other time you took that long walk and got the paper and walked back to where you started from, and it all happened in less than an instant." "That's right," Lynn said. "He should be. As a matter of fact," Phil said, "I think he should. So it worked after all. I'd really hoped it would, or maybe... but I think it worked." "What worked?" Lynn and Dorothy demanded together. "He must have tossed that paper into the flame by now, unless he read what was on it," Phil said. He spread his hands apologetically. "You see, I knew this couldn't go on forever. The only way to fight the supernatural is to outsmart it, I figured. So I wrote on it. Simple as that. I bore down good, too, so that if the ink came off, the writing would still be creased and good. On the theory that whatever was on that paper would come true when it got burned." "What did you write?" Again, Lynn and Dorothy spoke in unison. "I didn't have time for anything involved," Phil apologized. "I rather expected him to be after me before I could go far." "What did you write?" "Just one word," Phil said. "Canceled." "Canceled?" Lynn and Dorothy echoed dumbly, then comprehendingly. "Canceled." "Sure," Phil said. "That way, when it was burned, it wouldn't do anything. They'll have to start over on you." They stared at him wordlessly. "It must have been burned by now," he said weakly. "So my scheme worked." They turned their heads and looked into each other's eyes. 2 ghostly windshields obscured their vision. The tables and people about them faded to be replaced by ghostly pines, a more solid concrete highway. They stared into each other's eyes, knowing all that had been, feeling it slip away. But abruptly it vanished, and they were looking at each other across the table while a waiter asked them if they wanted another drink. For a long second their minds hovered in that other stream of time, before the realization came that it was over, and they were safe. "Another?" Lynn said. "Yes, sure. You want one, Dorothy?" She nodded and watched the waiter's back as he hurried away. "You two look as if you'd seen a ghost," Phil said. "I would almost swear that paper reached the flame a second ago." Dorothy turned to him. "It did," she said. "And I don't know whether to be happy about it or never forgive you." "Why?" Phil asked. She looked at Lynn, her eyes soft and luminous. Her hand reached out and nestled in his. "Well," she said, "it seems to me the least you could have done while you had the opportunity was write on it for us to live forever." She laughed nervously. Lynn flicked the ash off the end of his cigarette and grinned at her. That would have been tempting fate, he said. End of Destiny Uncertain by Rog Phillips.